Hey everyone, Gravity here. Before the video begins, I simply ask that if you enjoy my content to hit that subscribe button below. Nowhere else on YouTube are you going to find a Battlefield player who's played with teams competitively since Battlefield 1942 nearly 18 years ago. Don't forget to subscribe, and please enjoy the video. Over the nearly 20-year history of the Battlefield franchise, there have been many great maps worthy of praise. Some maps become legendary, icons themselves of the Battlefield series and worth remembering for their balance, uniqueness, and special gameplay. This is the story of the best maps in Battlefield. Often overshadowed by many of the other African campaign maps of Battlefield 1942, Tobruk was one of those maps that became more enjoyable and respected the longer the game's life went on, and later retroactively once Battlefield 2 came out. Partially discredited by many Battlefield 1942 players for being too simple and too small, Tobruk was a unique map that starkly contrasted the larger maps of El Alamein and Gazala. Although these other desert maps were more popular, they frequently offered a poor experience for both infantry combat and tank play. Not having any aircraft was one way Tobruk was set apart, as well as being tighter and more push-focused. In the early days of Battlefield, many players were unused to this style of play, instead preferring maps with smaller engagements. Tobruk was a Conquest assault map, with the German team attacking the British defenses. 6 compactly designed flags were all the defenders had. These flags were arrayed in 3 defensive lines, with the first line having 3 flags, the second line having 2 flags, and the last line, which was the main British base, 1 flag. The defensive lines and flags were connected by a series of minor trenches, offering some protection from advancing tanks. Interestingly, the close proximity of flags made it fairly difficult for the Germans to advance effectively unless multiple flags were attacked at once, as reinforcements and respawning players could counterattack from different directions along the line. However, this worked just as well for the German side once a few flags were taken, resulting in a tough back and forth throughout the round. One might think that because there were so many tanks on the map, it was just an infantry slaughter. This really wasn't the case because, as only Battlefield 1942 players could tell you, compared to future Battlefield games, the tanks of BF 1942 were downright terrible. A single landmine killed them. Dynamite could be tossed far. AT rockets did significant damage. And grenades, freaking grenades, did outrageous damage to them as well. In addition, tanks themselves were clumsy, rocked back and forth like mad, and the shells had a huge drop. Lastly, the shallow trenches did a decent job of covering infantry, who were far more concerned with the enemy lobbing nuclear bombs, grenades, than enemy tanks. The German attackers had access to 3 Panzer IV medium tanks, 1 Tiger heavy tank, and 1 Wesp artillery tank. The British defenders had 4 Sherman medium tanks, 1 M10 heavy tank, and 1 M7 Priest artillery tank. Several jeeps, despite having poor handling and trouble with the terrain, were available for flank attempts and, more often than not, suicide jihad car bombs against enemy tanks. The brilliance of Tobruk was that as the Germans advanced, the tougher it was to push forward because the action became more and more concentrated. The final push on the British base was all chaos, all action, with German tanks trying to push through and kill people trying to get into the new tanks. It wasn't necessarily a grind due to the fairly wide front, and it did allow all forms of weapons and gameplay. To some of you watching this and thinking, wow, this would make a great breakthrough map in Battlefield 5, you deserve a cookie. Tobruk was essentially a back and forth breakthrough map way ahead of its time. The way the defensive lines are arrayed, the lack of planes, the mixed and balanced dynamic between tanks and infantry play, it would have done well to see a remake in Battlefield 5, as long as it had a major makeover of the trench system and the defensive fortifications. Tobruk was a map that embodied map balance as best as it could in Battlefield 1942, something that was often taken for granted during its time. It subversively advocated team play and coordination, and players could make the round what they wanted of it. Infantry, anti-tank, tanking, artillery, you name it. It was one of Battlefield 1942's best, a sleeper hit, one which deserves a remake, or at least a little praise.